You are nothing more than an insolent, arrogant commoner.
I assure you, madam, I am very much more.
If Eulalia Lindale had remained silent for one more minute, her life would almost certainly have followed. The ordinary course expected of an unmarried gentlewoman with no fortune. Instead, she looked across her father's dinner table, told a complete stranger that he had no manners, and unknowingly offended one of the most powerful men in England. Years later, she would often wonder whether destiny had entered her life at that exact moment, or whether it had been waiting quietly beside the fire long before the first course was ever served. Nettlecombe was not the sort of house that inspired admiration. It was an old Somerset manor whose weathered stone walls and ivy-covered windows spoke of better generations rather than present prosperity. The gardens had gradually surrendered their roses to vegetables, the silver had been polished so many times that it had grown thin in places, and every improvement to the estate depended less upon money than upon careful management. Yet nothing about the house suggested neglect. It reflected something quieter, a family determined to preserve its dignity even after comfort had slipped away. Eulalia had become the heart of that quiet determination. Since her mother's death, she had managed the household with calm efficiency, stretching every pound as far as it would go without allowing either servants or tenants to feel the full weight of the family's declining finances. At 25, she had long accepted that marriage was becoming less likely with each passing season. But the knowledge troubled her father far more than it troubled herself. When Mr. Lindale announced that an influential gentleman named Mr. Pendreth had accepted an invitation to dinner, hope returned to the house with surprising force. He believed the visitor might be interested in supporting a drainage project that would rescue part of the estate from years of poor harvests. Whether the investment ever materialized mattered less than the possibility itself. For several days, the servants prepared with unusual care, the best linen was brought from storage, and the final respectable bottle of claret was placed upon the dining table. Eulalia did not share her father's optimism. Experience had taught her that wealthy gentlemen rarely changed the fortunes of struggling families simply because they possessed the means to do so. Even so, she said nothing. Hope deserved encouragement, especially when it belonged to a man who had devoted his life to protecting everyone around him. A problem in the kitchen delayed her until the meal had already begun. By the time she entered the dining room, the introductions were over. "My daughter," Mr. Lindale said warmly. The gentleman opposite acknowledged her with the slightest inclination of his head before returning his attention to the conversation. He appeared to be in his middle 30s, tall, impeccably dressed, and undeniably handsome, though there was a reserve about him that discouraged familiarity. His amber eyes observed everything without appearing genuinely interested in any of it. At first, Eulalia dismissed him as merely quiet. The impression changed before the soup had been cleared. Her father worked tirelessly to make his guest comfortable, speaking with genuine enthusiasm about the estate, the surrounding farms, and the improvements he still hoped to make despite increasingly difficult circumstances. Each subject was offered with the simple pride of a man who loved his home. The gentleman answered politely, but never warmly. His replies grew shorter. His silences grew longer. He accepted every kindness without seeming to notice the effort behind it. No single remark could have been called offensive. Yet together they created an unmistakable impression that nothing beneath Nettlecombe's roof deserved more than passing attention. Eulalia watched her father's confidence slowly disappear. Mr. Lindale laughed too quickly at remarks that required no laughter. He hurried to refill wine glasses before anyone requested. Every few moments he searched his guest's face for some sign that the evening had succeeded, only to find the same courteous indifference waiting there. She had seen that expression before. It belonged to people who confused privilege with superiority. When the gentleman finally remarked that country dinners had an unfortunate tendency to resemble one another, the words were spoken so casually that they might almost have passed unnoticed. They did not. A heavy silence settled over the room. Her father immediately attempted to rescue the conversation, but Eulalia spoke first. "Perhaps," she said evenly, "they seem alike because some guests make no effort to distinguish one from another." The stranger looked at her for the first time that evening with genuine attention. She knew she ought to stop. Instead, she continued, "My father has spent days preparing for your visit. Everything you have eaten tonight was offered with generosity, not obligation. Yet you have accepted every kindness as though it were merely expected." Neither servant nor family member moved. "If this house disappoints you, that is your privilege." Her voice remained calm. "But kindness deserves courtesy in return." She met his gaze without hesitation. "I do not think you are bored because the evening has failed you. I think you are bored because you have chosen to be." The silence that followed seemed endless. Mr. Lindale had gone pale. Eulalia realized she had almost certainly destroyed whatever opportunity her father had hoped the evening might bring. The gentleman continued looking at her without speaking. Then, almost imperceptibly, something changed in his expression. For the first time all evening, the distance disappeared from his eyes. "No," he said quietly. "No one has ever told me that before." Without another word, he turned back toward Mr. Lindale. "You were explaining the Western Meadow." The conversation resumed as naturally as though nothing unusual had happened. From that moment onward, he listened with genuine attention, asking thoughtful questions about the estate and discussing practical improvements with unexpected interest. Only after his carriage disappeared into the autumn night did Mr. Lindale reveal the truth. "Our guest was not Mr. Pendreth," he said softly. "He was Philip Pendreth, the 6th Duke of Pendreth." The words drained the colour from Eulalia's face. She had publicly accused one of England's most powerful noblemen of having no manners. Yet her father seemed strangely thoughtful rather than distressed. As he was leaving, he said quietly, "He asked me to repeat your name." Then he repeated the Duke's final words. "Your daughter is the only person who has spoken honestly to me in 11 years. Do not ever persuade her to become anyone else." That night, as the Duke's carriage disappeared into the darkness, Philip told himself he would forget Miss Eulalia Lindale before morning. He did not. Philip Pendreth had every intention of forgetting Miss Eulalia Lindale before he reached the county boundary. It would have been the sensible thing to do. She was the daughter of a country gentleman whose modest world revolved around a quiet Somerset manor, while he carried one of the oldest titles in England and all the expectations that came with it. Their acquaintance had lasted no more than a single evening. By every rule of society, they would never meet again. Yet memory proved strangely stubborn. Since inheriting the dukedom 11 years earlier, Philip had grown accustomed to admiration that always wanted something in return. Men sought his patronage, ambitious mothers pursued his title, and society had long ago decided what sort of life he ought to lead. After enough years, praise became indistinguishable from calculation, and agreement became so constant that he scarcely listened anymore. Eulalia had wanted nothing. She had believed him an ordinary gentleman, one she would likely never see again, and had still chosen to tell him the truth. Because she could not watch her father's kindness repaid with contempt. What lingered in Philip's mind was not the boldness of her words, but the uncomfortable certainty that she had deserved to say every one of them. She had been right. He had allowed the grief he carried since Edmund's death to harden into discourtesy. His younger brother had been everything Philip was not: warm where he was reserved, impulsive where he was cautious, generous without effort. A foolish quarrel had separated them before Edmund left for Italy, and pride had delayed the letter Philip meant to write until another arrived instead, announcing that Edmund had died of a fever beneath a foreign sky. Since then, Philip had mistaken numbness for strength. That evening at Nettlecombe, a young woman in a gown 3 seasons out of fashion had quietly reminded him that grief did not excuse unkindness. He told himself he would forget her. He did not. Winter passed. At Nettlecombe, life resumed its familiar rhythm of accounts, repairs, and careful economies. The Duke gradually became nothing more than an uncomfortable memory, while Mr. Lindale occasionally repeated the strange words spoken at the carriage door. "Your daughter is the only person who has spoken the truth to me in 11 years." Eulalia never understood why those words mattered. Surely a man like the Duke had forgotten her already. When her aunt Mrs. Verity Cardew once again invited her to spend the London season in town, Eulalia surprised everyone, including herself, by accepting. She had refused for 4 consecutive years, unwilling to parade herself through fashionable ballrooms. where fortune mattered more than character. But something about that winter persuaded her to make the journey at last. London proved exactly as exhausting as she expected. Mrs. Cardew hurried her from dressmakers to dinners, from musicales to assemblies. Determined that her niece should finally meet a suitable husband before society declared her permanently overlooked. 3 weeks into the season came the Harkis ball. Eulalia sensed the Duke's arrival before she saw him. Conversations softened, fans slowed, and every eye turned toward the entrance. When she followed their gaze, Philip stood beneath the chandeliers exactly as she remembered him, composed, distant, and quietly observing the room. Then he saw her. Without hesitation, he crossed the entire ballroom. "Miss Lindale. Your Grace. You seem surprised. I had imagined you would have forgotten me." A faint smile touched his expression. "I have found you remarkably difficult to forget." He offered his hand. "May I have this dance? I have discovered that I would rather spend an evening speaking with the only person who ever disagreed with me than with a room full of people determined to agree." Half of London watched them cross the ballroom together. Lady Sidonia Mall watched more closely than anyone. Over the weeks that followed, Philip's carriage became a familiar sight outside Mrs. Cardew's house. London no longer questioned whether the Duke admired Miss Lindale. It merely speculated how serious his intentions had become. One rainy afternoon, Philip noticed a volume of sermons resting beside Eulalia. "What do you think of it?" he asked. She smiled apologetically. "I think it was written by a man who has never been poor, frightened, or hungry, yet feels perfectly qualified to lecture those who have been all three." Philip considered the answer before quietly closing the book. "You have a remarkable gift. For offending people. For disagreeing with me." He looked toward the rain-streaked window. "You are the only person who argues with me. Everyone else has agreed with me for 11 years. It is rather like living in a house full of mirrors." She studied him for a moment. "That sounds like a very lonely way to live." He offered no reply. He did not need one. By the end of the season, Philip understood that he could no longer imagine returning to the life he had lived before meeting her. One afternoon, while walking through Mrs. Cardew's narrow garden, he finally stopped. "Miss Lindale," he said quietly, "I am about to make you an offer. And I will not insult you by pretending it is more romantic than it is." He explained everything with complete honesty. Society hunted him for his title. Society hunted her with equal determination, though for entirely different reasons. Neither wanted the endless performance expected of them. So he concluded, "I propose that we refuse it together." "You are proposing," Eulalia began slowly, "a marriage of convenience." "I am. I offer you honesty, respect, complete independence within my household. And my word that I shall never lie to you." He hesitated only once. "I am not offering love. I do not believe I have any left." Eulalia looked at him steadily. "I think you are wrong." She spoke of the man who had remembered a stranger for months, crossed a crowded ballroom to greet her before anyone else, and valued truth above admiration. Those were not the actions of someone incapable of love. For the first time, Philip told another soul about Edmund. When he finished, the silence between them carried neither discomfort nor pity, only understanding. Then he asked once more, "Will you marry me, Miss Lindale?" "On one additional condition." She waited. "That neither of us shall ever lie to the other, however difficult the truth may be." Eulalia thought of Nettlecombe, of her father, of the dinner where everything had begun. Then she smiled. "Yes," she said softly, "on those terms." Their marriage became the quiet sensation of the London season. Few people understood why the Duke of Pendreth, after refusing some of the most celebrated young women in England for more than a decade, had chosen instead a country gentlewoman whose greatest distinction. Society explained it as a practical arrangement, and in one sense it was correct. Neither Philip nor Eulalia attempted to deny that their marriage had begun with reason rather than romance. Yet from the moment Eulalia arrived at High Hall, she began quietly changing the great house without ever trying to change it. The servants had expected a fashionable duchess whose first concern would be appearances. Instead they found a woman who learned their names before asking for their titles. During the formal reception welcoming the new duchess, Eulalia noticed a young housemaid trembling near the back of the hall. The girl's face had lost all color, and although she tried desperately to remain standing, she looked ready to faint. Before anyone else realized what was happening, Eulalia stepped away from the receiving line. "You have a fever," she said gently. The frightened maid immediately apologized. "I'm very sorry, Your Grace, I didn't wish to disappoint anyone." "You won't." Turning to the housekeeper, Eulalia continued with quiet authority. "Please send her upstairs immediately. Ask the doctor to see her. And make certain her wages are not reduced because of today's absence." The housekeeper hesitated only a moment before nodding. By evening, every servant in High Hall knew the story. The new Duchess had noticed the weakest person in the room before she admired the grandest one. Respect came naturally after that. Philip watched the transformation with silent admiration. For years, he had believed loyalty could be earned only through fairness and responsibility. Eulalia taught him that kindness inspired something deeper within only a few weeks. High Hall no longer felt like a house that belonged to generations of dukes. It had become a home. Their marriage settled into an easy companionship. Each morning they shared breakfast before Philip disappeared into estate business, returning only as evening approached. At first, they followed the traditions of High Hall, dining at opposite ends of an enormous table that required servants to repeat half the conversation before either could hear it properly. After enduring the arrangement for several evenings, Eulalia looked thoughtfully along the endless polished table. "This seems rather inconvenient for two people who are supposed to be sharing a meal." Philip smiled faintly. "It has always been done this way." "I don't doubt it." She met his eyes. "But perhaps tradition should occasionally make room for common sense." The following evening, the places had been moved closer. Neither of them ever suggested changing them back. Not long afterward, Philip asked her opinion on plans for a new mill that promised to increase the estate's income. Eulalia read every page carefully before placing the documents aside. "The mill itself is sensible," she said. "But these fields belong to 4 tenant families." Philip frowned. "My steward believes the land can be reclaimed." "Perhaps." She shook her head gently. "But those families cannot reclaim the years they would lose while waiting." He studied the maps again. She was right. Once more, she had noticed the people hidden behind the numbers. The plans were altered before construction began. When the grateful tenants later thanked Philip, he accepted the praise without correcting them. Only Eulalia knew whose wisdom had truly guided the decision. One rainy afternoon, while searching for a misplaced account book, Eulalia wandered into a part of High Hall she had never visited before. At the end of a quiet corridor stood a door left slightly open. Inside, everything remained untouched. Books rested where they had been placed years earlier. A riding crop leaned against the fireplace. Letters lay neatly arranged upon a writing desk. The room felt less abandoned than patiently waiting. Philip found her there several moments later. For the first time since their marriage, genuine pain crossed his face. "This was Edmund's room," he said quietly. "I never found the courage to change it." Eulalia looked around without speaking. Nothing in the room suggested death. Everything suggested love interrupted too soon. She gently took Philip's hand. "You don't honor him by refusing to live." The words lingered between them long after they left the room. That evening, for the first time, Philip spoke freely about his brother. Not only about the guilt, but about the laughter, the adventures, the impossible schemes. By the end of the conversation, Eulalia realized something extraordinary. He was remembering Edmund with affection instead of regret. Healing had finally begun. Not everyone welcomed the Duchess's growing influence. The Dowager Duchess observed her new daughter-in-law with cautious approval, while society watched with increasing curiosity. Lady Sidonia, however, watched with something altogether different. She noticed how often Philip sought Eulalia's opinion before making important decisions. She noticed the quiet ease that had begun replacing years of careful distance. Most of all, she noticed that England's most unattainable duke was slowly becoming a happier man. And she decided that happiness would not be allowed to last. By the beginning of autumn, even London had begun to admit what High Hall had known for months. The Duke of Pendreth had changed. The man once known for his careful reserve now smiled more often, lingered longer in conversation, and sought his duchess's opinion with a confidence that no longer surprised those closest to them. Society, however, preferred a different explanation. It insisted that the change could not possibly be love. It had to be gratitude, convenience, or simple habit. No one encouraged that belief more eagerly than Lady Sidonia. For years, she had assumed that if Philip ever married, it would be because duty demanded it rather than affection. Watching him gradually become happier beside another woman unsettled her more than she cared to admit. If the marriage truly remained one of convenience, then it could still be undone. She chose the Duke's annual autumn ball to prove it. The ballroom at High Hall glittered beneath hundreds of candles as guests from across England gathered beneath the great chandeliers. Music drifted through the room while conversations rose and fell with practiced elegance. Yet beneath the refinement ran the familiar current of curiosity. Everyone wanted to see the Duke and Duchess together. Lady Sidonia waited until a circle of influential guests had formed around Eulalia before stepping forward with effortless grace. "My dear Duchess," she said warmly enough to invite an audience. "I have often admired the remarkable understanding that exists between you and His Grace." Eulalia smiled politely. "We have been fortunate indeed." Lady Sidonia lowered her voice just enough to make everyone listen more carefully. "Though I sometimes wonder whether affection is really necessary when too sensible. People agree upon a practical arrangement." The room grew noticeably quieter. She continued before anyone could interrupt. "His Grace has always been a man governed by duty rather than sentiment. I imagine such marriages are often the happiest, provided neither party expects very much." The implication required no explanation. Everyone present knew the Duke's marriage had begun as one of convenience. Lady Sidonia merely wished to remind them. For a brief moment, silence settled over the group. Then Eulalia answered, "I believe you are mistaken." Her voice remained calm, carrying none of the sharpness Lady Sidonia had hoped to provoke. "A marriage may begin for practical reasons." She glanced across the ballroom toward Philip. "But people are not condemned to remain exactly as they were when it began." Several guests exchanged quiet looks. Eulalia continued gently, "The greatest privilege of loving another person is watching them become more fully themselves. If that has happened in our marriage, I can only be grateful." Lady Sidonia's smile faltered. She had expected embarrassment. Instead, she found quiet confidence. At the opposite end of the ballroom, Philip had heard enough. He crossed the room exactly as he had crossed the Harkis ball months before, unconcerned by the conversations that fell silent in his wake. Stopping beside Eulalia, he looked first at Lady Sidonia, then at the assembled guests. "I believe," he said evenly, "there is one misunderstanding I should finally correct." The ballroom became perfectly still. "When I asked my wife to marry me, I believed I was offering her a marriage founded upon." He turned toward Eulalia. "I was wrong." A faint smile touched her lips. "You taught me that honesty demands more than speaking the truth. It also requires acknowledging it." He took her hand. "I told you I had nothing left to give except respect. I did not yet understand that grief had merely hidden what remained." His voice softened. "Eulalia, I love you." The words were simple. They carried more weight than the grandest declaration could have done because everyone who knew the Duke understood how rarely he spoke without complete sincerity. For a moment, Eulalia simply looked at him. Then she smiled through tears. "I know." The orchestra, uncertain whether to continue, remained silent. Philip lifted her hand and kissed it before every guest in the ballroom. "I should have said it much sooner." "You said it when you were ready." She laughed softly. "And I have known for rather longer than you." A ripple of warm laughter spread through the room, breaking the last of the tension. Even those who had doubted the marriage understood they were witnessing something no title or fortune could ever have arranged. Life at High Hall continued much as before, though it seemed lighter somehow. The great house still demanded endless attention, tenants still required wise decisions, and Philip still sought Eulalia's opinion before making any important change. The difference was that neither of them any longer pretended those conversations belonged merely to duty. 2 years later, The nursery echoed with the laughter of a dark-haired little boy named Edmund. Philip often stood quietly at the doorway, watching his son race through the gardens. With the same boundless enthusiasm his younger brother had once possessed. The grief he had carried for so many years never disappeared entirely. But it no longer defined the man he had become. One evening, as the family gathered around the dining table that Eulalia had insisted on shortening years before, Philip looked across at his wife with the familiar smile she alone had first uncovered beneath years of silence. "Do you know," he said thoughtfully, "that everything changed because you told a complete stranger he had no manners?" Eulalia laughed. "I remember thinking it was probably the greatest mistake of my life." It was. He reached for her hand. "It was also the greatest blessing of mine." Outside, autumn settled peacefully over High Hall. While inside the house, the warmth of family filled every corner. And Philip often reflected that the truest thing anyone had ever given him was not admiration, nor obedience, nor even forgiveness. It had been the courage of one honest woman, who refused to let grief become an excuse for forgetting kindness.